Welcome to the next episode of Northern Exposure. I'm here this afternoon with a fellow Torontonian via New York City, Will O'Hare. And I'm going to begin by asking Will to introduce himself. Will?
Hi, good afternoon, Rick. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm a freelance portrait, event, and documentary photographer, as you said, based here in Toronto. I'm here full time now, about a year and a half after being for the better part of 2 decades in New York City. And of course, during kind of lockdown in this COVID period, mostly here at home, and been doing a lot of editing and going through the archives and doing production work, but I'm eager to get back out and photographing people, which is really my passion.
So one of the things that I've been asking our guests is to spend a few minutes talking about how they came to photography and how their practice developed over the years.
Right. Well, I guess photography for me for a long time was just a hobby. My background as an artist is actually in theater. I was a director, trained as an actor, and then became a director and an educator. It's actually what first brought me to Toronto, was being an education director for a Shakespeare theater company here. It's no longer around, but it was called the Classical Theater Project. And what I found was that, you know, with theater, you always needed a room full of people, you needed sets, you needed lights, you needed all kinds of things to make it happen. And so as a creative outlet for myself, and as a way to kind of feel like I could be creative and also kind of unwind, clear my head, I would just walk the city. And I would say first that happened in New York, and then while I was here in Toronto, and just for hours, walk the city with a camera and taking photos. And I started to develop this passion for just documenting the world around me. And so it was really something that was just on the side. Fortunately, the theater company that I worked for, they were also looking for photographers because they needed promotional material for the shows. I also wanted better photographs of the shows that I was directing. And so I started photographing those, and then actors wanted headshots. And so it kind of organically grew through that connection. In 2012, I moved back to New York City, and for the first time actually started pursuing it professionally. And I happened to have a friend who was a photo editor at the Commercial Observer, and he started booking me for assignments, and then I started building up my client base from there. But I always came back to just wandering the city with a camera. To me, is kind of where I feel most at home.
As you know, the format is to begin with you talking about a photo taken by another photographer that you think speaks to you, that has some enduring power. And I know that you've chosen one, and we'll go to that now, okay?
Yes.
We're ready to
go. Yeah, excellent. So this photo that I selected is by the photographer Garry Winogrand. This is maybe one of the most well-known street photographers of the kind of mid 20th century. And this is a photograph that I wouldn't even say this is my favorite photograph of his, but it's one that I kept coming back to, because since when you'd reached out to me, I started thinking through photographers that I was drawn to. And for Winogrand, definitely as somebody who was almost manic about being out in the street with a camera, that took over 1 million photographs in the film days, in the pre-digital days, was just a force on the street, constantly photographing, not hiding in the shadows, but being out in the midst of people. And I kept coming back to this one because there was something about it that just was resonating to me with this time period that we're in right now, and this movement that we're in right now, and with Black Lives Matter, and the importance of people being out on the street and having their voice heard. And so there was something that I felt like, in a lot of ways, this photograph could have been taken 2 weeks ago. I'm not I think with this one, it's just called Protest and the date is unknown. But this is in New York City. It's down on Wall Street. I could tell, behind the figure that's in the center there is George Washington, the statue of George Washington in the background, which also jumped out at me during this time as well. But our eye is kind of drawn to these figures here, the young Black protesters. There's an older woman who's kind of standing with them. And there's this barrier that separates the protesters from the police officers, that kind of gives this diagonal line in the photograph there and gives it this kind of energy. And one of the things that Winogrand was known for was his tilted horizons. And so, of course, we have that here where everything is kind of tilted, skewed off to the right. And so we start here, if we kind of look at the diagonal from the top left with the two police officers. One is looking off to the right, perhaps a bit anxious in his expression there. And if our eye line then keeps going that same direction, kind of like as well as that police line barrier, till we get to the protesters there. And their eye line is going past those police officers. We're not quite sure what they're looking at. There's one of them is pointing off to something off frame to the left side.
It's really great how their glances cross. So you're right. The cop looking to his right. You have the woman looking very hard to the left, and then you have these other gazes that are they're like vectors coming together.
Mm-hmm.
You have this man right here with the sunglasses looking directly at the camera, and Winogrand has really, caught what, on the one hand, could be a confusion of gazes, but it really helps make the photo. I'm really pleased that you selected this one.
Well, I feel like sometimes, often in his work, the question becomes about the gaze. Who is looking either at the camera. And it is interesting, you notice that figure of the man with the glasses. And of course, we don't see, his actual eyes behind the glasses, but it looks like he's looking right down the barrel of the camera. Others are looking off. And it kind of puts us in the scene in a certain way that I felt was really powerful. It just really makes it feel like we're there. And I think one of the reasons I kept coming back to the photo is that I kept wanting to look to the left. Mm-hmm. As I sit here with it, I keep wanting to look and say, what are they looking at that's over there? And that makes me feel like I'm in it, as opposed to an observer that's outside of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Listen, before we move on, do you want to say anything more about Garry Winogrand and his rather eccentric approach to working the street?
Yeah, well, so I was kind of doing a deep dive. I saw an exhibition of kind of a retrospective of his work a few years ago that was at the Met, and then I think it traveled over to Europe after that. And I finally caught up with, recently, there was a documentary called Everything is Photographable, that aired on PBS, and you can now rent it online. Which is a pretty good documentary on his work. It's not overly biographical. It's more about, really how he developed his kind of style, but his almost kind of pretty chaotic, loose approach on the streets. I think, as I said before, he was not somebody that lurked in the background, but there's somebody in an interview that I had to note down a way of describing his style, which was a tender assault to the streets. And in fact, Diane Arbus, who is a contemporary photographer, and they knew each other, she described him as an instinctive, nearly primitive ironist, so totally without malice, so unflinching, even cheerful. About Winogrand was that he put himself squarely in the middle of people on the street. And again, like I was saying, wasn't hiding and shooting from the side. But he kind of did it with a smile and with a cheerfulness and with a way that kind of disarmed people, I think. It's not like a Bruce Gilden get up and assault and put a flash in people's face. It's interesting. He even said himself that he hates the term street photography and being a street photographer. He says that doesn't tell me anything about the photographer or the work. So he kind of was really resistant to putting labels on things. And as he said, there's a couple of quotes that he said directly that I really liked. I photograph to see what things look like photographed, right?
That's a really nice little aphorism. You had mentioned when you were introducing Winogrand that he shot millions of frames in the old analog mode. And as I understand it, after he passed away, when they were inventorying his estate, they found tens of thousands of undeveloped film canisters squirreled away.
That's right. He was described in his later years, and he died tragically in 1984. He was diagnosed with cancer, and he went down to Mexico to try to find a cure. And the clinic that he went into, and the treatment did not go well, and he died. But he had been up until that point kind of in this mania of constantly taking pictures, and the idea of developing and editing them was kind of very much secondary to his work, which is also one of the things that's kind of drawn me to him. I mean, Winogrand, also like Vivian Mayer, that there's the process of taking the photo on the street, and then there's the process of curating and editing it and developing it. And in a lot of ways, they're very separate. And most photographers, combine those two things are really, really connected. And yet I am really fascinated by what is that impulse to just capture, to just be there, to just click the shutter button.
Well, that's a good segue from Winogrand's work to yours. And you've chosen a photo, and why don't we turn to that one? Okay, here's a picture from your own archive. Will?
Okay, right. Thank you so much. Yeah, so this photo I took in 2014, and it was actually coming across this photo that I came back to thinking about the Winogrand. And then and looking at these two almost together, I felt they complement each other or speak to each other in a certain way. So this was December in 2014 in New York City. It was called the Millions March NYC. This is the very beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and this is right after Tamir Rice, the young 12-year-old African-American boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who was shot and killed by a white police officer in a park. He had a toy gun in his hand and was tragically killed in November of 2014. So this is weeks after that, and also right after the acquittal, or they failed to indict the police officer in the Ferguson case. And 30,000 people came out into the streets, and the energy that we've been feeling very much over the past few weeks was really kind of starting here in 2014. And this is a moment where I've been walking with the crowd, and I moved just like out of the people who were walking, came around behind these police officers and turned back into the crowd. And it was just at this moment when this young protester here was holding this sign, just happened to make eye contact with me, and looking right at the camera as I snapped the photo here, framed by the police officers. But to me, this idea of Tamir Rice, who was a young person, and as well as this protester, just it spoke to me the power of this time in this moment. And to come back to this photo, I haven't looked at it in a few years, to look at it 6 years later, and to feel like in a lot of ways we're in the same place, but then also to look back at Garry Winogrand's work back in the 60s, and to say that, not that much has changed. Just really powerful to me.
It is a very powerful photo. I really like the way the shoulders of the two officers frame the protester. And as with the Winogrand, the gaze really makes it. You can try to imagine um, that she didn't make eye contact with you in the camera. If her gaze
Mm-hmm.
was elsewhere, it wouldn't be such a wonderful shot, but it really is, it does capture the moment beautifully. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you. No problem.
Do you want to take a moment and talk a little more about your ongoing work on the streets? And maybe think of
Sure.
this as part of a series?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, living in New York City for nearly 20 years, documenting protest movements, starting from when I was first in New York. I was actually there for 9/11. And then during the whole kind of anti-war protest movement through to Occupy Wall Street, to the more recent kind of Black Lives Matter. So one aspect of my work that I'm definitely drawn to is the notion of protests and people expressing themselves out on the street. I think it is something really tied to our democracy, our essential sense of democracy, and kind of who we are as a society, through people expressing themselves in that way. It's not the full extent of everything I do. I mean, I do also sometimes, I think the challenge with street photography is also just capturing the mundane and capturing the everyday, and the kind of photographs that will probably speak more to people down the road and in years to come than as opposed to now. But the power of capturing moments of people expressing themselves, is certainly something that drives me.
Great, very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I'm sure this will be a popular episode. I'll put up some links when I get it up. One to Garry Winogrand's work, and one to some of your own stuff. But thank you again, Will.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rick.